This video is the second part in a two-part series giving you a behind-the-scenes look of my studio setup. In the first part I talked about my computing setup and my audio setup, and if you haven't seen that I invite you to watch that video, link in the description below. In this part I'm going to talk about my video and streaming setup because there are some things that I do differently to other people, so this might actually be interesting to some of you. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel I talk about digital media, game design and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. An invite link is in the description below. And since you're already at it, please don't forget to press the like button because of reasons. I need to start with the disclaimer that I also made in the first part of the series, and that is that I'm fully aware that the speaker setup is not optimal. So before anybody gets too excited and posts comments in the comment section pointing out that this is the worst way to set up speakers, I am aware of that. The reason I have it set up like that is because it essentially grew organically, and I ended up really liking the way this looks. So this is a compromise between the visuals and the sound really. And if you've seen the first part of the series, then you know that I actually managed to get this speaker sound really well, much better than you would expect, given that their position. So it actually works for me, and kind of if it works, why change it? And with that out of the way, let's get into my streaming and video setup. Now, I already mentioned in the first part of this video that I have the video setup completely separated from my computing and audio setup. And the reason I'm doing that is primarily so that I don't have any additional computing load on my laptop that I'm using as my central processing unit here. That essentially allows me to use every bit of CPU power that I have in order to demonstrate the software that I want to demonstrate. And the video recording itself does not really take any load off that system. Now let's get through the system in two steps. First, I'm going to talk about the audio setup and then about the video setup. Now, for the audio, I'm starting with the Shure SM7B. I'm honestly not completely sure if I would buy that again. It is a nice microphone. It is a microphone that sort of you almost have to have because that's sort of everybody has that. But I'm not entirely convinced that it is actually worth the price. So if you're watching this and you're thinking what type of microphone should you get, it's a nice one. But, kind of there are other options out there as well. The main objective in setting up my system was to create something that is as self-contained as possible so that I don't have to do any post-processing later on. And the way I do that is through hardware. So I have three hardware devices that essentially kind of process my audio. The first one is a microphone preamp. The one that I'm using is a DBX 286S. That's a very popular one. I'm apparently using it in order to give the Shure SM7B enough gain, and then I'm also using it for the gate. I have a little bit of de-essing going on. I have a little bit of compression going on, but not really much. I'm not really using the bass boost or the treble boost at all. That's not what I'm using. Instead, I'm routing the audio that goes out of the 286S into a graphic equalizer. The one that I'm using is the DBX 131S, which is inexpensive and for my purposes is good enough. The idea being that now I'm essentially kind of making sure that my voice sounds as good as possible. Now, if you have been watching my videos, you know that my sound, the sound of my voice is still not perfect, so there's still a lot of room for improvement, but I'm starting to get better, and every video that I do is it's an iterative approach. Every time I create a new video, I kind of make a couple of adjustments, and it's getting better and better over time. Now, from there, the audio signal goes into my mixer. The mixer is an Yamaha MG10XU, and here is this mixed together with all the other signals. One signal, for example, is the signal coming from the computer audio, and that is coming through, if you've seen last week's video, the Sheet Modius digital analog converter that I'm using in lieu of an audio interface, and that is essentially here mixed together. Now, if you've been paying very close attention, you might have noticed that there's a bit of an issue if I'm connecting my Sheet Modius DAC with my Yamaha mixer. And the reason for that is because both the Sheet Modius as well as the Yamaha mixer is connected to my computer via USB. So if I'm connecting them with an audio cable, that actually creates a ground loop. So in order to get rid of that, there are special cables that you need to use. So whenever you are in a situation like that where you have a lot of devices and you're connecting them to your PC and you're interconnecting them, there are all kinds of possibilities for ground loop. In this particular case, that was very easy to solve with a very special cable that essentially disconnects the ground from one to the other device, and that essentially works perfectly. From the Yamaha mixer, the signal then runs into the ATEM switcher, and that is essentially where it is recorded. Now, with that being said, let's look at the video setup. For the video, I'm currently using two cameras. The first camera is a Sony A5100. That's a camera that I bought used 2 years ago. It was very inexpensive back then. They're much more expensive today. And that camera has a Samyang 12mm. That's a very inexpensive lens in front of it. It's a manual lens, but it's good enough for the purpose that I'm using it for. That's the camera system that I started out with. So if you're watching some of my first videos, that's actually the system that I use there. Currently, it's used as a side camera. The main camera that I'm currently using is a Sony CVE10 vlogging camera. That's the one with the interchangeable lens. It's a really nice system, highly recommended. And that has a Sigma contemporary lens in front of it. That's the classic 16mm contemporary lens that a lot of vloggers use. And one of my most recent additions is the teleprompter in front of it. The teleprompter here is actually connected to my computing system. So this is actually just showing me an additional computer screen that I can use, for example, to read scripts or to simply watch somebody in a meeting. I kind of like to use that in a way so that if I'm in a meeting, I actually look the people into the eye. So I have this Zoom screen in front of me, and I essentially can use the teleprompter for that purpose. But I could also use it as a regular teleprompter if I wanted to. Now, if you want to use a teleprompter in the way that I'm doing it here, so essentially as an additional computer screen, be aware that you will need to mirror the image because you're essentially looking at a mirror, right? Now, if you are on a Mac, that's very easy to do, but if you're on Windows, that's a little bit more complicated. The way I do it here is that the signal is actually going through an extra converter that has the capability of mirroring. And the converter that I'm using is a Decimator MD Cross device that is essentially an HDMI to SDI conversion device that I had previously used for another setup, and I just had it laying around, but that actually has the capability to mirror the video. And that device then kind of forwards that video into what's essentially a Raspberry Pi screen. That's a 7-inch Raspberry Pi screen, and that makes a really nice teleprompter that is actually not particularly expensive, with the exception of the Decimator device. Now, the video from these cameras doesn't go directly into the ATEM Mini, and the reason for that is because I recently switched to a sort of 4K workflow. Now, the ATEM Mini can only record in 1080p. So what I'm doing is I'm recording the streams that come from the main desktop as well as the stream that comes from the main camera in 4K separately. I'm not really producing my videos in 4K, but I'm using the 4K footage in case I need to zoom in into something. So for example, if I'm zooming into my desktop and I want to do that in a way that I don't lose quality, I can do that by going back to the 4K footage and kind of zooming in that way. Now, this is done through HyperDeck devices. The desktop video, the video that comes from the desktop screen, goes into a HyperDeck 4K Pro, which is a really nice device, by the way. So it's a little bit expensive. It's the most expensive device that I have. But if you're on the fence of getting a HyperDeck, I highly recommend that one. That is close to perfect. And that essentially records the desktop in 4K 60. And from there, it goes into the ATEM Mini Extreme. And the video that comes from the Sony camera, because the Sony camera can only do 4K 30 anyway, I decided to buy a HyperDeck Studio Plus, which is the one that essentially is primarily meant for HD, but it can record in 4K 30, and that's essentially I'm using there. And from there, it goes into the ATEM Mini again. And then I have an additional older HyperDeck that I use in order to play back certain files. So for example, I can play back my intro in a live feed. So all these video feeds, the audio feeds and everything then goes into my ATEM Mini Extreme ISO and is there recorded. And the nice thing about the ATEM Mini ISO Extreme is that it essentially records everything in form of a DaVinci Resolve project file. So I can take that into DaVinci Resolve and then essentially do any post-processing, any final editing there. But I already have a rough cut that comes out of the ATEM Mini Pro ISO. Now, in terms of monitoring, there are two additional things I probably should mention. The first is that for monitoring the video, I'm using just a very basic field monitor. That's a 5-inch field monitor, very inexpensive, and that kind of allows me to view the multi-view of what's coming out of the ATEM Mini Extreme. And the signal is then passed on to a device that extracts the audio, and the audio is then passed on to a TC Electronic Clarity M device, and that allows me to monitor the audio levels. And I like that particularly because it allows me to monitor the audio levels in exactly the way they are in the HDMI signal. So this is really nice, and this allows me to keep track of what's going on. So I'm rarely clipping, kind of sometimes I'm not paying attention, but it sort of allows me to see what's going on and if everything that I'm doing is in check and all the audio levels are correct. Now, I already mentioned last week that for monitoring the audio, I'm using the Focal Elysia headphones. That's a little bit overkill, to be perfectly honest, but I got them very, very cheap at the sale, so I had to get them, and they're really nice. Now, I wouldn't use them for mixing and mastering. Those are not studio headphones, but they're very comfortable to use. They give a very nice sound, and so I'm using them for monitoring my video that I'm producing. The reason I need these types of headphones is because when you're producing video and you're sitting essentially in front of a microphone, you would like to have closed headphones. So these are actually my closed headphones that I'm using. And the final device that I should mention is that I'm also using a second Stream Deck. And the reason I'm using a second Stream Deck is because this is not connected to the PC. So my first Stream Deck is essentially connected to the PC. The second Stream Deck is connected to a Raspberry Pi. And this Raspberry Pi controls the ATEM Mini Extreme through the Companion software. Now, the reason I'm doing it that way is because Companion is actually very resource intensive. So if you have that run on your machine, it takes up quite a bit of resources. So I found it to be much more usable if I have that offloaded to a Raspberry Pi, and it actually works quite nicely. So I have a Raspberry Pi here tucked away somewhere, and that essentially runs the Companion software to control the ATEM Mini. Now, if you watched that video closely, you might have noticed that I also have an additional computer here standing on the left, and that is a very old cheese grater Mac. It's from 2011, so it's more than 10 years old. And I used this computer as a recording device before I had the ATEM Mini Extreme. So essentially in my first videos, what I essentially would do is I would pass on the video to the secondary computer, and the secondary computer then would use OBS in order to record everything. And I have not used that computer for a while, so it just sits there as a secondary computer in case something goes wrong. But I didn't have to use it for a long time because the ATEM Mini Extreme is actually very reliable. So this is really everything I wanted to say today. So you now know exactly how I do things and how everything works around here. Now, to be perfectly honest, this is probably going to change over the next couple of weeks because, as you all know, we are constantly trying to improve. And same thing here. There are a couple of things I already have in mind that I want to change, but this is probably going to be subject of another video. Now, if you have any questions to anything that I was talking about, any product that I used, any gear that I use, please leave a comment in the comment section below or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.